Ernst Winder sat at a plain hospital desk in 1950 with a single sheet of paper in front of him and a pen in his hand, and he asked the man across from him how many cigarettes he smoked each day. The man answered. Winder wrote it down. Then he moved to the next room and asked the next patient the same question and wrote that answer down too. He was a medical student at the time, not yet a doctor, not yet the author of anything that had changed anyone's mind, and the work he was doing looked, from the outside, like nothing more than a careful accumulation of small facts, a number on a form, a name, a diagnosis, a habit reported in plain language and recorded in plain longhand. The stack of completed interview forms beside him grew slowly across days, and then weeks, and then months, each one representing a single person in a hospital bed, and the question that had been put to them, and the answer they had given. By the time Winder and the thoracic surgeon Everts Graham had finished, they had interviewed 684 lung cancer patients. The forms sat in a pile. The information in them had not yet been arranged into anything a reader could hold up to the light and follow with their eyes. That would come later, when the counting began, and the sorting, and the tabulation of what all those individual answers, placed side by side, actually showed. What they showed was this. Of the 684 patients, 96.5% were moderate to heavy smokers. The number sat quietly in the data, the way numbers do, not announced, not underlined, simply present. Winder and Graham wrote it into a paper and submitted it to the Journal of the American Medical Association, and the paper was published in 1950, and the number sat there in print for anyone who cared to read it, which was the kind of thing that at the time seemed sufficient. Everts Graham was a surgeon who had spent his career working inside the chests of living people. He understood, in a way that a person who had never operated could not quite understand, what a lung looked like when it was wrong. He had been skeptical of the study's own conclusions when it began, cautious about what the numbers would show, uncertain whether the association between smoking and cancer could be proven in the way the question seemed to demand. He continued smoking through the period when he and Winder were conducting the research. He smoked while the interview forms accumulated. He smoked while they wrote the paper together. The numbers in the paper, when the tabulation was done, did not immediately change his habits. He was a scientist. He knew that an association in a case control study was not by itself a proof of cause. What it was, though, was a signal, a pattern too consistent to set aside without examination. On the other side of the Atlantic Ocean, in almost exactly the same months, two other researchers were producing almost exactly the same signal from almost exactly the same kind of work. Richard Dahl was a physician and statistician working at the Medical Research Council in Britain. Austin Bradford Hill was an epidemiologist who had spent years developing methods for turning medical observation into something that could withstand mathematical scrutiny. Neither of them knew, at the outset, that their inquiry into rising lung cancer rates would point where it pointed. They began, as researchers often do, with the knowledge that something had changed and the question of what might have changed it. Lung cancer deaths in Britain had been increasing steadily across the previous decades. The causes being discussed in the medical literature ranged widely: improved diagnosis, road tar, motor car fumes, atmospheric pollution from industrial sources. Smoking was on the list, but it was one candidate among several, and no one had yet produced the kind of evidence that could narrow the field. Dahl and Hill published their case control study in the British Medical Journal in 1950. Like the Winder and Graham study, published in the same journal year, it compared lung cancer patients with matched controls and asked systematically what the two groups did differently. The answer that came back from the data was consistent with what the American study had found. The lung cancer patients were, in large proportion, smokers. The controls at the same proportion were not. Two research teams on two continents. Two sets of patients gathered through two different institutions. Two separate statistical analyses. One answer. The consistency of that answer between independent research groups was itself a fact worth noting, because it meant the result was not the artifact of one investigator's methods or one hospital's patient population. Whatever the data was pointing at, it was pointing there from two directions at once, but both of these were case control studies, which meant they were retrospective. They looked backward from a diagnosis and asked what had preceded it. The objection that could be raised, and was raised, in letters and editorials and academic corridors, was that recall might be imperfect, that patients might attribute meaning in retrospect to habits that had been ordinary and unquestioned during the years they practiced them, that some unknown third factor might be driving both the cancer and the smoking in ways the study design could not detect. These were reasonable scientific cautions. They were the kind of cautions that good researchers take seriously, because the alternative, claiming certainty where the design of the study cannot deliver it, would be worse science, not better. Richard Dahl and Austin Bradford Hill took the cautions seriously. The answer they arrived at, in taking them seriously, was to design a study that could not be accused of the same limitations. Rather than looking backward from illness, they would look forward from health. Rather than comparing patients to controls on the basis of what they recalled about their habits, they would enroll healthy people, record their habits at the outset, and then follow them forward through time to observe what happened to them. The British doctor's study began in 1951. Its enrollment was, by the standards of prospective research in that era, formidable. Letters went out to physicians across Britain, to general practitioners and consultants and specialists in every field, practicing in cities and in small market towns and in rural areas where the post took an extra day, asking them to complete a questionnaire about their smoking habits and to agree to allow their health outcomes to be tracked across the years that followed. Approximately 40,000 physicians responded and enrolled. 40,000 people agreeing to be part of a record that would follow them without their having to do anything further, simply through the ordinary passage of their lives. The enrollment forms arrived back by post. Each one was a small document, a name, a specialty, a location, a set of answers about daily smoking habits and number of cigarettes, about whether the respondent had ever smoked and had stopped, about how many years the habit had been in place. Taken individually, each form said something unremarkable about one person's life. Taken collectively, across 40,000 people, they constituted the beginning of a picture that would take decades to develop fully, the kind of picture that only time can produce, because the question it was designed to answer was not what happened in the past, but what would happen in the future. Dahl and Hill did not know, in 1951, exactly what the picture would show. No one did. That was the design. The data would come in slowly, year by year, as some of the enrolled physicians became ill, as some were diagnosed, as some died, and the cause of death was recorded, and as all of that information was mapped back against the smoking habits each person had described at enrollment. The study was not built for speed. It was built for accuracy, and accuracy in a question of this kind required time. Among the findings that both studies were producing, and that other researchers were beginning to confirm from their own work, was one that had particular weight in statistical terms. It was the dose-response relationship, the observation that heavier smokers did not merely show a higher cancer rate than non-smokers, they showed a higher cancer rate than lighter smokers as well, and that the relationship between the amount smoked and the cancer risk appeared to rise in a consistent gradient. The more a person smoked, the higher their risk. The line on the graph, when the data was arranged to display it, climbed. A dose-response relationship carries a specific kind of evidential force. When an association exists simply between the presence of a factor and the presence of an outcome, it can be argued that both are responding to some third, unidentified cause. When the relationship is graded, when more of the factor produces more of the outcome in measurable increments, the argument for a third unidentified cause becomes considerably harder to sustain. The third factor would have to be not merely present alongside both variables, but calibrated to the same degree as the smoking habit itself, producing proportionally more cancer in heavier smokers, for some reason unrelated to the smoke they were inhaling. The statistical improbability of that arrangement was not zero, but it was small enough to require serious work to maintain it as a proposition. Evarts Graham looked at the dose-response relationship in the Winder and Graham data. He was a rigorous thinker, trained in a discipline that demanded precision about what the body showed and what it did not. He continued to smoke for a period after the paper was published. At some point, sometime after seeing what the numbers showed about heavier smokers and their outcomes, he set the cigarettes down. The historical record does not preserve the exact moment of that decision or what preceded it, or whether he said anything about it to anyone. What the record preserves is that he stopped, and that in 1957, Evarts Graham died of lung cancer, bilaterally, in both lungs at once. He did not publish a commentary on that fact. It simply happened, the way things in the documentary record of medicine often happen. A man who had studied a pattern became part of the pattern, and the record noted it without ceremony. Austin Bradford Hill had been thinking, across his career, about something larger than any single study could address. The problem was one that anyone who worked in epidemiology encountered eventually, the question of when an observed statistical association justified a conclusion about cause. An association was a correlation. A correlation was a relationship between two things that changed together. But the world was full of things that changed together without one causing the other, and the discipline of epidemiology needed principled criteria for distinguishing the meaningful from the coincidental. Hill began articulating those criteria in lectures and papers across the 1950s, drawing on the body of work that the smoking and cancer research, among other programs of investigation, had made available. In 1965, he formalized 9 criteria for what he described as aspects of association that were worth considering when trying to determine whether a relationship between a factor and an outcome was likely to be causal. The criteria included the strength of the association, how large was the measured difference between exposed and unexposed groups. They included consistency. Had the association been found repeatedly by different researchers in different populations using different methods? They included specificity. Did the factor in question relate to a specific kind of outcome rather than a diffuse range of effects? They included the biological gradient, the dose-response relationship, the observation that more exposure produced more effect in proportion. They included coherence with existing biological and medical knowledge. They included experimental evidence, whether reducing exposure to the factor produced reductions in disease, and several others besides. None of these criteria, Hill was careful to say, was individually sufficient to establish causation. None was individually capable of ruling it out. They were not a checklist that, when completed, delivered a verdict. They were a framework for thinking, a structured way of asking what the evidence, taken together, was most reasonably pointing toward. The 9 criteria became what is sometimes called a standard for causal inference in epidemiology, not because Hill had legislated that they should be, but because they described, in careful and usable form, what careful researchers had been doing in practice, and what the accumulating work on smoking and cancer had helped make visible as a problem worth formalizing. The smoking and cancer research of the early 1950s was, in a real sense, one of the bodies of work through which those criteria were being discovered. The researchers were not applying a pre-existing checklist. They were doing the work, and the checklist was emerging from the doing, shaped in part by what the data on smoking kept insistently showing. In the United States, the work was expanding. The American Cancer Society had its own statistician, blijven open Petrie, blijven persand, your moderate zorgspor, rekenheer dogweer. Kyler Hammond, a careful and methodical man who had been thinking about prospective research design and what it could accomplish at scale. His colleague Daniel Horn had complementary expertise. Together, in 1952, they began organizing what would become one of the largest prospective studies of smoking and health ever attempted in the United States. The enrollment target was 187,000 American men, not physicians, as in the British doctor's study, but a broader cross-section, men of various occupations and educational backgrounds and regions, drawn from across the country through a network of American Cancer Society volunteers who recruited participants in their own communities. Enrollment packets went out, questionnaires were completed and returned. The scale of the operation was logistical in a way that resembled more a postal census than a conventional research study, hundreds of thousands of individual responses flowing back through the mail system to be sorted, recorded, and filed. Each enrollment form was, by itself, a modest thing, a page of questions, a name, a set of answers about daily habits. But at the scale of 187,000, the modest things accumulated into something with statistical power that no small study could approach, a picture of smoking habits spread across an enormous and varied population, waiting only for time and outcome data to make it speak. The waiting was not very long, as prospective studies go. Hammond and Horn presented results publicly in 1954. The findings confirmed, in a larger and differently constructed sample, what Winder and Graham and Dahl and Hill had found in their case control work, a dramatic association between cigarette smoking and cancer mortality. The word dramatic was appropriate in statistical terms. The differences between smokers and non-smokers in the outcome data were not small and borderline, they were large and consistent. The association held across the varied population the study had enrolled. The dose-response relationship held as well. The heavier smokers in the Hammond and Horn data showed higher mortality than the lighter smokers, and the line maintained its gradient when the data was arranged to display it. 4 major studies, 3 countries, multiple research teams working independently, case control designs checked against prospective designs, statistical associations confirmed across different populations and different methods, a dose-response relationship appearing consistently enough to carry its own evidential weight. By the early 1950s, the scientific literature on smoking and lung cancer contained enough convergent evidence that the question being asked by researchers was no longer simply whether an association existed. The question was becoming what, precisely, the association was and what biological mechanisms underlay it, and how the causal picture could be filled in further. The men who conducted this research were not, in the main, crusaders or advocates. They were working scientists applying the methods of their disciplines to a question that the data had made urgent. Winder was a medical student when the work with Graham began, not an authority, not a prominent figure, simply a person who had noticed something in clinical data and asked whether the pattern was real. Dahl was a careful methodologist who had started with multiple hypotheses about the cause of rising lung cancer rates and followed the evidence toward the one that best fit. Hammond was a statistician whose professional identity was bound up in the precision of the numbers rather than in any particular conclusion the numbers might produce. Hill was a theorist of epidemiological method who wanted to understand what his field's tools could and could not legitimately claim. They were not, in 1950 or 1951 or 1954, saying anything that required extraordinary courage to say. They were publishing in peer-reviewed journals the results of studies that other researchers could examine and critique and attempt to replicate. The process was ordinary scientific publication, the kind of activity that medical journals had been designed to accommodate, the kind of thing that happened in universities and research institutions every week. The findings were striking, but the activity of producing and publishing them was the most routine thing a working scientist could do. What was less routine was the scale of the public implication. Cigarette smoking in the United States in the early 1950s was not a marginal habit. It was practiced by roughly half the adult population. It had been embedded in American life across decades of cultural normalization, commercial promotion, and ordinary social ritual. The people enrolled in Hammond and Horn's study, 187,000 of them, were not a peculiar subgroup. They were a cross-section of the country, and the data being produced about what smoking was doing to that cross-section was accumulating, quietly and methodically, into a record that was growing too large and too consistent to remain merely the concern of medical journals. The record grew slowly. That is the nature of prospective research. The enrollment happens once, the questionnaires are completed and returned, and then the data comes in across years and decades as the enrolled population ages and outcomes are recorded. The British Doctors Study, which enrolled approximately 40,000 physicians in 1951, would continue producing data across the following half-century. The findings from its early years confirmed the association that the case control work had found. The findings from its later years would extend and deepen those conclusions in ways that the 1951 design had been built to eventually deliver, though no one in 1951 would live to know what the final picture would look like. Each year that passed, another layer of outcome data accumulated. Each physician who had mailed in an enrollment form in 1951 was, without doing anything further, continuing to contribute to the study, their health, their diagnoses, eventually their deaths, and the recorded causes of them, all of it flowing back through the ordinary medical record-keeping systems of the National Health Service into the data that Dahl and Hill were maintaining. The physicians did not know, when they filled out the forms, how long the study would run. They had agreed to be tracked. The tracking was happening, quietly, as their lives proceeded. There is something particular about the image of a general practitioner in a British market town in 1951, filling out a questionnaire on a weekday afternoon between patients, answering questions about how many cigarettes he smoked, and whether he had smoked before and for how long. He would have treated the form as a professional courtesy, a colleague's study, the kind of thing one participated in as a member of a medical community that believed in research. he would not have spent long on it. He would have sealed the envelope, put a stamp on it, and placed it in the post on his way to something else, the way people deposit small obligations into letter boxes on gray mornings, without particular ceremony. That envelope, and the 40,000 others like it, would accumulate into a picture of what smoking did to a population across decades of ordinary living. The picture would take time to emerge. The forms themselves were already in transit, moving through the postal system toward the address on the questionnaire, each one a small and unremarkable piece of a record that was, in its full dimensions, going to take most of the century to be complete. Richard Dahl would follow the British doctor's study for the rest of his long career, publishing findings from it at intervals across 50 years. The study's data would eventually show, with a clarity that the early years could only suggest, the magnitude of the effect that smoking had on life expectancy, not merely whether it caused cancer, but by how many years it shortened a life, and what happened to that shortening when a person stopped smoking and at what age. The enrollment forms from 1951, the ones that arrived by post on ordinary weekday mornings to be opened and sorted and recorded, were the foundation of all of that. The research that the forms made possible would take decades to deliver everything it had been designed to find. One of those envelopes was sealed on a gray morning in Britain in 1951 by a physician whose name the historical record does not necessarily preserve, and placed in a post box somewhere along the ordinary route of a workday. The stamp was affixed. The envelope fell into the collection box and waited among other letters for the postman's round. It was one form among 40,000. It said in the compact language of a questionnaire what one doctor did with tobacco, and for how long, and in what quantity. What it would eventually contribute to, in its small fraction of the whole, was a record detailed enough and long enough to produce conclusions that the sciences of human health had rarely been able to produce about anything, the conclusions of a prospective study carried forward through time, with the patience that questions of this kind require, into a picture that no single year's data could have made visible. The envelope moved through the post. The study began. The decades in which its data would accumulate stretched out ahead, unhurried, in the ordinary way that time stretches when it has a great deal of careful observing to do. In a printing plant in the early hours of January 4th, 1954, the air was thick with the warm metallic smell of fresh ink and the dry dust of newsprint moving fast through mechanical rollers. The press operators had been working since before midnight. Each press was loaded with the same text block, set in the same clean typeface, and by the time the first gray light touched the windows of the plant, the pages were already stacking up in the output trays, hundreds of identical columns of carefully worded sentences reproduced in the same formation across 448 different newspaper editions, moving toward doorsteps and kitchen tables across the country in the same hour. The text that morning occupied a full page. It did not carry the usual markers of an advertisement, no product name in large letters across the top, no illustration of a smiling figure, no price or offer or call to action in the final line. It was formatted in columns of dense formal prose, the kind of layout that a reader in 1954 would have associated with an editorial, or a letter from a civic organization, or an announcement from a professional body of some kind. The words at the top of the page read, "A frank statement to cigarette smokers." Below that, in the body text, the language was measured and earnest. The men signing it said, accepted an interest in people's health as a basic responsibility, paramount to every other consideration in our business. The statement ran in papers from New York to Los Angeles, from Chicago to Atlanta, from small regional dailies to large metropolitan broadsheets. An estimated 43 million readers encountered it that morning, or in the days that followed when their edition arrived. For most of them, the page would have looked like what it was designed to look like: a sincere public statement from responsible industry leaders who were taking a difficult question seriously. The typeface was the same as the news columns around it. The register was formal and measured in the way that public announcements tend to be. There was nothing about it on the surface that announced itself as a paid commercial placement. A newspaper in January of 1954 was a layered object. There were news stories on the front page, selected and verified by editors, the product of reporters asking questions and sources responding, and copy desks checking facts before anything went to print. There were opinion columns, carrying the bylines of commentators whose perspectives were understood to be perspectives. There were classified advertisements in the back pages, and display advertisements through the body of the paper, and most readers had a reasonably clear understanding of what belonged to which category. A news story had been through a filter, a paid advertisement had not. The Frank statement was a paid advertisement that had been formatted to remove every visual signal that would have told a reader which category it occupied. The wire services that morning were also carrying science stories. Studies from British and American medical researchers had been making news since 1950. Findings about the relationship between cigarette smoking and rates of lung cancer among the patients who had been surveyed and tracked. A reader opening their newspaper that January morning might have encountered, somewhere in the same edition that carried the Frank statement, a science headline about the health risks associated with cigarettes. The two items, the science story and the industry statement, would have been printed in the same typeface, sitting in the same physical paper, one the product of editorial selection and the other the product of a coordinated placement. From the outside of the page, they looked like two entries in the same information stream. The Frank statement had not been composed quickly or casually. The meeting at which its strategy was planned had taken place about a month earlier, in December of 1953, at the Plaza Hotel in New York City. The hotel was on Fifth Avenue, a formal building in the manner of a European grand hotel, and the executives who gathered there that winter represented the leading American tobacco companies: Philip Morris, R.J. Reynolds, American Tobacco, Lorillard, and others. They had come because the science stories had been accumulating, and because they had recognized, collectively, that a coordinated response was commercially and legally important. Sitting with them, taking notes on a legal pad, was John Hill, the founder of the public relations firm Hill and Knowlton. Hill and Knowlton was by 1953 one of the most prominent public relations firms in the United States. John Hill had built the organization on the premise that large institutions facing public credibility questions could be assisted in managing how those questions were framed. The tobacco executives came to the Plaza meeting with a problem that was essentially a framing problem. The scientific findings were real. They were being published in major peer-reviewed journals, and they were beginning to reach general newspaper readers. The question the executives needed answered was not a scientific question. It was a question about how to occupy the same public information environment as the science without conceding any of the science's conclusions. What Hill and his colleagues helped design over the weeks that followed was a statement whose central move was the appearance of openness. The Frank statement did not deny that questions had been raised about the health effects of cigarettes. It acknowledged the questions directly and then positioned the tobacco companies as partners in the effort to answer them responsibly. The language pledged cooperation with an independent scientific body that would conduct further research. It stated that the companies would not allow research findings to be suppressed. It characterized the companies as genuinely committed to the health of the public, as organizations that would follow the science wherever it led. None of this constituted a concession that the existing science was correct. Every sentence was constructed to project concern without narrowing any legal or commercial position. Reading the statement carefully, what it said and what it did not say sit at some distance from each other. It did not say that smoking was safe. It did not say that the existing studies were wrong. What it said, with considerable precision, was that the question was not yet settled, that more research was needed, and that the companies were prepared to support that research. This was a position that could be held indefinitely, because no single study, however large, constitutes absolute scientific finality, and because the language of more research is needed can be applied to any body of evidence without engaging with the specifics of what that evidence shows. The frank statement was worded in a way that could coexist with the scientific literature without requiring any response to it. The announcement that accompanied the frank statement was the creation of a new organization called the Tobacco Industry Research Committee. The committee was presented in the statement and in subsequent press releases as an independent scientific body established to fund rigorous, unbiased research into the health questions that had been raised. The name carried the weight of an institutional frame, the word research appearing alongside the word industry in a combination that suggested a body operating at the intersection of commerce and science in good faith. The committee's early stationery was printed with formal institutional language and a Washington address. Its correspondence looked like the correspondence of a scientific organization rather than the product of a trade association. The funding mechanism for the Tobacco Industry Research Committee was built into the structure of the industry itself. Member companies contributed to the committee's budget based on a formula tied to the number of cigarettes they manufactured, a per-cigarette assessment that meant the larger the company's output, the larger its financial contribution to the organization presented as its industry's independent scientific watchdog. This arrangement was not publicized in the frank statement or in the early press coverage of the committee's formation. What the public received was the image of an independent scientific body. The financial architecture behind it was a different kind of object. The Tobacco Industry Research Committee's early scientific advisory board included several genuinely credentialed researchers. This was part of what made the organization function as it did. A body with no scientific credentials at all would not have been convincing. The presence of real scientists in advisory roles gave the committee's existence a surface that could withstand basic scrutiny. Reporters who called the committee for comment on a science story would reach someone who spoke the language of research methodology and could discuss the questions in a register that sounded like engagement. The committee's function, in this sense, was not primarily to produce science. Its primary function was to produce the appearance of science and progress, the ongoing open-ended impression that the questions were being responsibly investigated by people who were qualified to investigate them. The science, in January of 1954, was already several years old. Ernst Winder and Everts Graham had published their case control study in the Journal of the American Medical Association in 1950. Richard Dahl and Austin Bradford Hill had published their parallel findings in the British Medical Journal in the same year and had already begun their long prospective study of British physicians. Even Kyler Hammond and Daniel Horn had been tracking a large group of American men since 1952 and had presented preliminary findings in 1954 that pointed in the same direction as the earlier research. These were not fringe publications or preliminary observations. They were peer-reviewed studies in major medical journals, produced by methodologically careful researchers using established epidemiological methods, and their findings were consistent with one another in ways that were statistically difficult to attribute to coincidence. The frank statement strategy, as a document, was to occupy the same public space as this body of work without engaging with any of its specific findings. It did not address Winder and Graham's numbers. It did not discuss the dose-response relationship, the finding that heavier smokers faced proportionally higher cancer mortality, which was one of the most statistically compelling features of the existing research. It did not name Richard Dahl or Austin Bradford Hill, or describe what their prospective study of 40,000 physicians was designed to measure. What it offered instead was a general acknowledgement that medical research of recent years had produced claims about health effects, followed immediately by the suggestion that these claims were not yet conclusively established, and that further research was warranted. The specific evidence was dissolved into the general category of claims, and the category of claims was then surrounded with language implying that responsible, fair-minded inquiry was ongoing. A reader who encountered the frank statement without already knowing the details of the medical literature would have come away from it with a specific impression that the question of whether cigarettes posed a health risk was still genuinely open, that serious people on both sides were engaged in good faith investigation, and that the tobacco companies themselves were participants in the effort to find the truth. This impression was created entirely through the arrangement of language. None of it required the statement to assert anything that was technically false. It was constructed from true-sounding things: acknowledgement, concern, commitment, openness, arranged in such a way that a false impression was the reliable result. The printing presses that produced the frank statement's 448 simultaneous editions had been running through the night. Press operators fed paper through rollers for hours, each sheet taking the same pattern of ink in the same arrangement. By the time the deliveries were made and the papers were opened on kitchen tables and unfolded on commuter trains and set out in the lobbies of offices and waiting rooms, the statement was already everywhere at once. This simultaneity was itself a feature of the strategy. A single newspaper carrying a corporate announcement would have been read by the readers of that paper. An announcement that appeared in 448 newspapers on the same morning entered the ambient information environment in a different way. It was not a local news item, but something closer to a national presence, occupying approximately the same cultural position as a major news story breaks across multiple outlets simultaneously. The public relations logic of this was precise. If the frank statement had appeared in one or two newspapers, it could have been addressed by other reporters in other papers who might have examined its claims critically. By appearing in 448 papers simultaneously, it arrived too broadly and too quickly to be processed journalistically before it had already been absorbed. The newspaper editors who ran it had been paid to run it. They had not reviewed it. The readers who saw it had no indication that it had bypassed editorial scrutiny entirely. It looked like a statement that belonged in the paper because it was formatted to look like that, and it was on every page because it had been purchased to be there. John Hill and his colleagues at Hill and Knowlton had understood, going into the December 1953 meeting at the Plaza Hotel, that the problem they were being hired to manage was not a scientific problem. The science was being produced by researchers at universities and hospitals using methods that were accepted in their fields. The problem was a public perception problem. Specifically, the question of how the tobacco companies could maintain their commercial position in a period when the scientific findings were accumulating in a consistent direction. The Frank Statement was the first public output of that framing project. The Tobacco Industry Research Committee was the institutional structure designed to sustain the impression of engagement with the science over the longer term. The committee's name went through several iterations in the period between the December 1953 meeting and the January 4th publication. Hill and Knowlton's internal discussions during this period centered on the question of how the organization should be described in public, what language would convey independence most convincingly, what institutional markers would make it most legible as a research body rather than a trade organization. The word independent was considered but ultimately not used in the committee's official name, perhaps because its use would have invited the question of what exactly made it independent. The phrase tobacco industry was kept, positioned alongside research committee in a combination that implied the industry's engagement with research rather than the industry's ownership of the research body. By the spring of 1954, the committee had begun awarding research grants to scientists at universities. The grants were real. The scientists were real. Some of the research funded was genuinely scientific. This was not incidental to the strategy, but central to it. A body that funded only marginal or peripheral work would not have maintained its credibility as a research organization for long. The committee needed to fund enough legitimate science to sustain its scientific image, while ensuring that the specific questions most directly relevant to the health effects of its member companies' products remained, as a practical matter, underexplored. How that balance was maintained over the years that followed is a question that the committee's own records illuminate, though those records were not public at the time they were being produced. The Frank Statement's language about suppression was among its most precisely worded passages. The companies pledged, in the statement, that they would not allow research results to be suppressed or distorted. This was a commitment made publicly and in print, included specifically to address the concern a reader might have that a research body funded by tobacco companies would not publish findings that were unfavorable to those companies. The pledge was categorical. It was also, as the record that emerged in later decades would show, a commitment that was structured around the specific mechanism by which findings could be made to disappear without technically being suppressed, the routing of internal research through legal counsel, which allowed findings to be classified as protected and withheld from the published record, without anyone having to describe this as suppression in those terms. That mechanism, however, had not yet been fully developed in January of 1954. What existed at that moment was the public statement, the 448 newspapers, the 43 million readers, and the Tobacco Industry Research Committee, a structure that had been assembled in the space of a few weeks to give the tobacco companies a public position they could occupy while the scientific work continued to accumulate around them. The statement was designed to be durable. It did not depend on the science stopping. It did not depend on the existing findings being refuted. It depended only on the maintenance of a certain public impression, the impression that the question was open, that the companies were engaged, and that responsible investigation was underway. A newspaper opened flat on a kitchen table in January of 1954 is a particular kind of object. It is a single morning's version of the world, assembled overnight by editors and printers and press operators, carrying stories that would reach that household and then be folded away. The Frank Statement occupied one full page of that object in 448 of its editions simultaneously. It sat beside news stories that had passed through editorial review, surrounded by the typographical language of journalism, formatted to invite the kind of reading that journalism invites, the reading of a statement that someone had checked, that represented something real, that could be trusted to mean what it said. The design was careful. The placement was deliberate. The simultaneous publication was the result of coordination across hundreds of papers in dozens of cities on a single winter morning. What the statement said about health, read closely, was limited and particular. It said that tobacco company leaders believed the products they sold were not harmful. It said that the existing studies had not established a causal relationship. It said that more research was needed and that the companies would support it. None of these claims was presented as the opinion of the company's public relations strategy. Each was presented as a sincere good faith assessment from responsible business leaders who had considered the matter seriously. The sincerity was part of the statement's design, not because sincerity was present, but because its appearance was necessary for the statement to accomplish what it was designed to accomplish. The Tobacco Industry Research Committee's founding announcement, in some editions, appeared on the same page as science news. A reader working through the paper that morning might have moved from a headline about a medical study's findings on lung cancer directly into the column of text that announced the industry's new research body. The two items sitting in the same visual field, printed in the same type, separated by a narrow column rule or a small amount of white space. The cancer risk findings and the industry's assurance of ongoing investigation occupied the same moment in the same physical paper. From the outside of the page, there was no visual signal that one item had passed through an editorial process and the other had been purchased. They appeared to a reader moving through the morning paper as two contributions to the same conversation. That proximity, the science item and the industry statement, sitting side by side in identical typeface, is a feature of January 4th, 1954, that the historical record preserves in detail. The Frank statement was not produced in isolation from the science it was responding to. It was produced in order to occupy the same public space as the science, to sit alongside it, to give readers encountering the science findings an adjacent item that provided a different frame. The frame was not a denial. It was something more durable than a denial, an expression of concern, a promise of investigation, an institutional structure presented as the proof that the promise was real. The press operators who ran the printing presses through the night of January 3rd into the morning of January 4th were carrying out ordinary work in the ordinary way. They fed paper into machines and watched type become print and stacked the output in the trays. The content of what they were printing was, from their position, one text block among many, a paid placement, formatted by the advertiser, arriving at the plant already set and ready to run. The coordination that had produced it, the December meeting at the plaza, the weeks of language work at Hill and Knowlton, the assessment of how many papers and which markets and what typeface and what register was not visible in the plant. What was visible was paper going in and printed pages coming out. By mid-morning of January 4th, the papers had been delivered, opened, read, and set aside in households across the country. The Frank statement had passed through the environment it was designed to pass through. In the days that followed, some science reporters wrote about it. Some editorialists commented on the industry's stated commitment to health research. Some medical researchers noted in letters to journals that the creation of a tobacco-funded research body did not address the methodological questions raised by the existing studies. The statement had been processed by the information environment, picked up, noted, distributed, and settled into the general understanding of where things stood between the science and the industry in January of 1954. The Tobacco Industry Research Committee continued to operate for decades under various names. Its stationery changed, its directors changed, the formal institutional language on its letterhead evolved with the period. What remained consistent was its structural position, a body funded by tobacco company dues, presented as an independent scientific organization, sustained by the credentialing function of real scientists and real grants in a framework designed to give the impression that the health question was being responsibly examined by people who were committed to following the evidence. The committee's founding document was the frank statement, published simultaneously in 448 newspapers on a January morning in 1954, formatted to look like a sincere public announcement and carrying in its most careful sentences a promise that was constructed more precisely than it appeared. The Tobacco Industry Research Committee's first formal correspondence went out to scientists at major research universities in the months after the frank statement's publication. The letters were written on institutional letterhead, with a Washington address printed cleanly at the top, and they described the committee's mission in language drawn from the scientific culture of the period, the language of rigorous inquiry, independent investigation, and the responsible examination of evidence. A scientist receiving such a letter in the spring of 1954 would have been looking at something that resembled, in every external respect, a letter from a legitimate funding body. The committee's name implied an organization at the intersection of an industry and a research mandate, and the letters reinforced that impression in their careful, professional language. The committee's budget, at that early stage, was already being calculated from the per-cigarette assessments. Its member companies were paying into it, a financial architecture that was not described in the letters and not visible in the letterhead, when not present in any of the language the committee used to describe itself to the scientists. It was approaching. A scientist in 1954 receiving a research grant from the Tobacco Industry Research Committee did not necessarily know the details of how the committee's budget was assembled, or what the relationship was between the committee's public description and its operational reality. What they knew was that the grant was real money, that the work they proposed to do was within their field, and that the committee's name carried enough institutional credibility to appear on a funding acknowledgement without raising immediate questions. The grants the committee awarded in its early years included work on genuine biological questions, studies that were not directly about smoking and cancer, but about adjacent topics in respiratory biology and general health research. This breadth was useful. A committee that funded only peripheral science would have been harder to describe as a serious research organization. A committee that funded a mixture of peripheral and tangentially relevant work could sustain, for an extended period, the claim that it was engaged in genuine scientific inquiry. The frank statement itself, once it had circulated through the newspaper environment of January 1954, did not disappear. It was reproduced in company materials, referenced in industry communications, and cited in public statements as evidence of the tobacco company's long-standing commitment to health research. The statement became, over time, a kind of founding document for the industry's public position on the science, a document that could be pointed to whenever the question arose of whether the companies had taken the health concerns seriously. Its existence as a formal, published, widely distributed statement gave it a durability that a press release or a spokesperson's comment would not have had. It had appeared in 448 newspapers. It had been read by an estimated 43 million people. It was, in that sense, a fact in the world, a documented expression of a position, and its documentary status made it available as an ongoing reference point for the companies that had signed it. The January morning on which the Frank statement was published was an ordinary winter morning in most of the cities where it appeared. People opened their papers in the usual way, moved through the pages in the usual order, folded the paper under an arm, or left it on the table, or passed it to someone else in the household. In some homes, the Frank statement page would have been read carefully. In others, it would have been passed over as one more block of dense text in a paper with many pages. The statement's reach, 43 million readers, was a statistical estimate of the number of people who might have encountered it, not a count of how many read it attentively or understood what they were reading. The environment it entered was the ordinary environment of a weekday morning in January, with its usual mixture of attention and distraction, and the particular half-present reading that most people bring to a newspaper before the rest of the day begins. The Tobacco Industry Research Committee's founding announcement sat in some of those 448 editions, beside news items about the medical science it had been created to respond to, a cancer risk headline, and an industry commitment to investigation, printed in the same typeface, in the same paper, in the same column width, in the same early hours of the same January morning, 2 entries in a shared information stream, one the product of scientific inquiry and editorial selection, one the product of a coordinated advertising placement designed to look like neither. That is what the historical record preserves from that particular morning, the presses running through the night, the text reproducing itself across hundreds of editions, the papers arriving in households and offices before the working day began, and somewhere in the pages of each one, a full-page statement printed in columns of formal prose, occupying the same visual space as the journalism around it, carrying language that had been worked and reworked over several weeks to say precisely what it needed to say, and nothing more than that. The Tobacco Industry Research Committee's founding notice, printed in the same typeface as the science story beside it, settled quietly into the public record of January 1954, 2 items on the same page, in the same morning's paper, leaving the reader to move from one to the other across a narrow column of white space. A researcher sits at a desk in the early morning, the room around her still and quiet, the screen in front of her showing a scanned page from 1969. The document is a memo. It is typed on plain paper in the ordinary fonts of its decade, and it sits in a digital archive that holds millions of pages like it, the internal correspondence of an industry, made searchable by court order after litigation concluded. She scrolls slowly. Most of the pages are routine. Budget discussions, meeting notes, correspondence between offices about minor administrative matters, and then, in the middle of one paragraph on one page, a sentence that reads as though it were a business observation like any other, something about market position and strategy, and the management of public knowledge, and the sentence contains the phrase that anyone who has spent time in this archive will eventually come to. Doubt is our product. The full sentence in its original context reads as part of a strategic summary. The author was considering how the tobacco industry ought to position itself against a growing body of published scientific evidence that linked cigarette smoking to serious illness. The memo was produced in 1969, inside Brown and Williamson, one of the largest tobacco companies in the United States at the time. Its author was reflecting on what the company's communication strategy should accomplish, and the answer the memo offered was particular and precise. Doubt, it said, was the best means of competing with the body of fact that existed in the mind of the general public, not the production of better evidence. not a scientific refutation of the studies that had been accumulating in the peer-reviewed literature for nearly 2 decades. Doubt as a product manufactured and distributed, aimed at the space between what a person had read in a newspaper and what they were certain enough of to act on. The memo was not discovered until litigation decades later brought millions of internal tobacco documents into the public record. For most of the years after it was written, it sat in a filing cabinet. It was not visible to the journalists who covered the tobacco industry during the 1970s, or to the physicians who counseled patients about their smoking habits, or to the senators who held hearings on public health. It was present, and it was private, and those two conditions held simultaneously for a long time. What the Legacy Tobacco Documents Library now holds is the accumulated record of that privacy, made legible at last, scanned, indexed, searchable, available to anyone with an internet connection and a few minutes to spare. The 1969 memo from Brown and Williamson was not an isolated document. It sat inside a much larger system, a set of deliberate arrangements that the tobacco industry had built over several decades to manage the relationship between what its scientists and legal teams understood privately and what entered the public record. One of the most carefully constructed elements of that system involved a funding mechanism that was designed to look like scientific philanthropy and to function as something else entirely. The Council for Tobacco Research maintained a general research program which awarded grants to scientists working on questions at some remove from tobacco's most pressing health questions, and it maintained, separately, a classified Special Projects Fund. The Special Projects Fund was different. It was administered not through the Council's ordinary processes, but through tobacco company lawyers, and the research it commissioned at major universities, including Harvard and Columbia, was routed through legal counsel from the beginning. This routing was deliberate. It meant that any findings the funded research produced could be classified as attorney-client communication, protected from disclosure in civil litigation and from congressional subpoenas by the same privilege that shields conversations between a lawyer and a client. The practical result was particular. A scientist at a major research university might receive a grant from what appeared to be an independent scientific body, conduct a genuine study using real methods, produce real data, write real conclusions, and then find that those conclusions could not be published. The knowledge was present in the building where the researcher worked. It existed in notebooks and on paper. The scientist who had produced it understood it and could describe it to colleagues in informal conversation. What the knowledge could not do was enter the published scientific record, the body of literature that other researchers built on, that physicians read, that regulatory agencies cited when making decisions about public health. It was sequestered, not destroyed, in most cases, simply held in a category that made it simultaneously real and officially absent. The distinction between knowledge existing and knowledge being available to those who needed it was something the Council for Tobacco Research's structure was built to exploit. The Council's public identity was that of an independent body funding open scientific inquiry into tobacco's health effects. Its stationery was formal and institutional. Its address was in Washington. Its grant letters went out on headed paper that carried the language of scientific institutions, references to peer review, to scholarly independence, to the support of rigorous research. A scientist receiving correspondence from the Council on a Monday morning would not, from the letter itself, have been able to identify the mechanism by which some of its funded research was structured to remain invisible. The gap between the appearance and the arrangement was built into the design. This was not a secret in the sense of a thing known to no one. inside the tobacco companies and inside the law firms that managed their litigation and research strategies. The arrangement was understood and documented. The lawyers who administered the Special Projects Fund knew what the fund was for. The executives who approved its budget knew what attorney-client privilege meant in practice. The public relations teams that described the council to journalists as an independent research body knew that the description was a partial one. The knowledge of what the council actually did lived in a set of private offices and conference rooms and filing cabinets, and it remained there, producing no trace in the public record. For the decades during which the scientific debate about tobacco and health was being publicly presented as unresolved. Victor DeNoble's laboratory at Philip Morris occupied a set of rooms in the company's research facilities in the early 1980s. The laboratory was equipped for behavioral research with animal models, cages, testing equipment, the ordinary hardware of a working science facility, and notebooks that accumulated over years of careful observation. DeNoble held a PhD in behavioral psychology and had been brought in to study nicotine's effects on the nervous system. His work was rigorous. He used the methods his field had developed for studying whether a substance functioned as a reinforcer, whether animals, given the opportunity to self-administer a compound, would continue to seek it out in ways that indicated the compound itself, rather than some secondary effect, was driving the behavior. Nicotine, in his data, functioned as a reinforcer. The animals in his studies behaved as though the substance had properties consistent with what pharmacologists, at the time, were beginning to understand as physical dependence. By 1983, DeNoble and his colleague Paul Mele had produced findings they considered significant enough to submit to a peer-reviewed journal. The journal accepted the paper. It was scheduled for publication. The scientific review process had examined the work and determined that its methods were sound and its conclusions warranted by the data. At that point, Philip Morris became aware that the paper was moving toward publication. The company's legal and public affairs teams reviewed what the paper said and concluded that findings confirming nicotine's addictive properties, appearing in print under the affiliation of a Philip Morris scientist, would create serious problems for the company's regulatory position. The paper was retracted before it could appear. Philip Morris required DeNoble to sign a non-disclosure agreement. The research program was terminated. The laboratory was dismantled. Dismantled is a word that lands quietly, but the physical reality it describes is specific. The cages were removed. The testing equipment was taken away. The notebooks were collected. The room that had housed several years of careful scientific work became an ordinary empty room with no physical record of what had been done there. DeNoble's data existed in his memory and in whatever personal notes he retained, but the institutional structure that had housed the work, the laboratory as a functioning scientific facility, was gone. The research had been conducted, and it had been concluded, and then it had been deliberately separated from the channels through which scientific knowledge ordinarily moved into public view. The non-disclosure agreement DeNoble signed meant that for years after the laboratory was dismantled, he could not describe what he had found or how he had found it. This was not an unusual arrangement for proprietary corporate research, but the subject matter of DeNoble's research made the silence something more than ordinary commercial confidentiality. The question of whether nicotine was physically addictive was not, in the early 1980s, a settled matter in public health discourse or in regulatory proceedings. Tobacco company executives were in the same years publicly presenting the question of nicotine's addictiveness as an open scientific question, one that responsible people disagreed about, one that required more research before any firm conclusion could be drawn. In private, Philip Morris possessed data from its own laboratories that bore directly on exactly that question. The data pointed in a direction the company found commercially harmful. The data was sealed. The Hill and Knowlton firm that had helped draft the Frank Statement in 1954 continued to work with the tobacco industry through subsequent decades, and the internal communications from that period, now held in the Legacy Tobacco Documents Library and searchable by any researcher, are documents of a particular kind. They are strategy memos. They describe audiences and messaging and the management of what the firm's executives called the controversy. The word controversy appears in these documents as a strategic object, something to be maintained, something that required active management. A genuine scientific controversy is a state of affairs in which the evidence is genuinely uncertain and expert opinion is genuinely divided. The communications that Hill and Knowlton's executives produced during the 1950s and 1960s describe the manufacture of the appearance of controversy, the deliberate extension into the public record of a state of apparent uncertainty that the firm's own people understood did not reflect the state of the underlying science. This distinction between a genuine controversy and the constructed appearance of one is not always easy to see from the outside. In a functioning public information environment, the way that genuine scientific uncertainty and manufactured scientific uncertainty look are not obviously different. Both involve disagreement. Both involve the citation of studies. Both involve the public presentation of expert voices on multiple sides of a question. The difference is internal. It is a difference between a process in which participants are trying to discover what is true and a process in which participants are trying to produce a desired public perception regardless of what is true. From the outside, watching the proceedings in a newspaper or on a television broadcast, the two processes could look similar enough that distinguishing between them required access to the private record, the memos, the strategy documents, the internal communications that described what the participants actually understood and what they were actually trying to accomplish. The Hill and Knowlton communications archived in the Legacy Tobacco Documents Library make it possible now to see that distinction. The firm's executives wrote to each other candidly about the difference between what the science showed and what the public could be persuaded to believe about it. They discussed which scientists were credible enough to be useful as spokespersons for the uncertainty position and which were too closely associated with tobacco company funding to be presented as independent. They worked through the language of public statements with attention to what each phrase would communicate to a general audience rather than to a scientific one. The memos are, in this sense, a record of professional competence applied to a specific strategic goal, and the goal is described in the memos with enough clarity that there is not much interpretive work required of a reader encountering them now. One of the arrangements that became visible in the documentary record was the use of what internal communications, sometimes called special projects, research commissions, that were structured from the beginning to produce a specific kind of result, or at minimum, to avoid producing results that would be harmful to the tobacco industry's public position. This was distinct from the more obvious kind of scientific fraud, in which data is simply fabricated or results misreported. The special projects mechanism operated in a more subtle register. A scientist might be funded to study a question that was adjacent to tobacco's health effects, but not directly focused on them, producing genuine findings about genuine phenomena, findings that could then be cited in public as evidence that the scientific picture was complicated and incomplete. Or a study might be designed with methodological parameters that made it unlikely to produce a clear result, so that when published, It could be described as showing that the question remained open. The research was real. The methods were real. The framing was the thing that was managed. A grant letter going out from the Council for Tobacco Research to a university scientist in, say, 1961 would have looked, on its surface, like the correspondence of a philanthropic research body. It would have named a specific research question, specified a funding amount, described the review process through which the grant had been approved, and expressed the Council's commitment to scientific independence and rigorous inquiry. A scientist reading it on a morning in a university department would have had no particular reason, from the letter itself, to understand the larger structure within which the grant existed. The Council was real. The money was real. The research being funded was in many cases genuinely conducted. What was not visible in the letter was the mechanism by which certain lines of inquiry were steered away from, the classified special projects channel that sat alongside the ordinary grants program, or the legal arrangements that ensured some of the most directly relevant research would be kept from the public record. The letter showed one layer. The architecture beneath it was something a researcher in the building would not have been able to see. What is notable about the internal documents that eventually became public is not primarily that they describe unusual human behavior. People managing organizations often produce private communications that differ from their public statements. Internal memos in many industries contain assessments of problems that the same industry's public communications present as non-problems. The tobacco industry's internal record is notable for a more specific reason, which is that the gap between the private assessment and the public position was maintained across so many institutions over so many decades on a question that directly affected the health of a significant portion of the adult population of most developed countries. The distance between what was known inside the relevant offices and what was permitted to reach the people whose decisions the knowledge bore on was, in both its scale and its duration, a particular kind of thing. Brown and Williamson's 1969 memo describing doubt as a product was written 19 years after the first major peer-reviewed studies linking tobacco to lung cancer appeared in medical journals. In the 19 years between 1950 and 1969, the scientific literature on tobacco and health had grown substantially. Multiple large prospective studies had been completed. The dose-response relationship had been replicated. The American Cancer Society had published findings. The Surgeon General had issued a report. The weight of published scientific evidence, available in medical libraries and increasingly discussed in general media, had moved considerably in one direction. The 1969 memo was written inside that context, and what it described was a strategy for operating within it, not a strategy for honestly engaging the science, but a strategy for producing, in the minds of ordinary people encountering news coverage of tobacco and health, a state of hesitation sufficient to defer action. The phrase body of fact, as the 1969 memo used it, is worth sitting with for a moment. The memo described doubt as the best means of competing with the body of fact that existed in the mind of the general public. The body of fact is acknowledged. The memo does not describe a situation in which the science is genuinely uncertain and in which the tobacco industry is legitimately representing one side of a genuine debate. It describes a situation in which a body of fact exists and is recognized to exist, and in which the strategic objective is to prevent that body of fact from translating into changed behavior. Doubt, the memo proposes, is the right tool for that prevention. The memo reads, in this way as a strategy document for a particular kind of communication operation, and it reads this way in part because it was written for an internal audience that did not need to be persuaded that the body of fact was real. David Hardy was a senior attorney at the firm of Shook, Hardy and Bacon during the years when tobacco litigation was developing into one of the most consequential areas of American product liability law. Hardy's role in the tobacco industry's legal and research strategy was substantial, and the documentary record that later became available in litigation describes his contribution to a central architectural element of the system: the routing of internal research through legal counsel, the mechanism by which findings produced by company scientists and company-funded university researchers could be classified as attorney-client communication was something Hardy helped design and implement. The practical effect of the arrangement was that when plaintiffs' attorneys in tobacco lawsuits or congressional staff subpoenaing records sought access to the results of research the tobacco companies had commissioned, they were met with assertions of privilege. The research existed, the data existed, the conclusions existed somewhere in the files of law offices. What the civil litigation process and the congressional subpoena power could not ordinarily reach was the content of attorney-client communications. This was a legal strategy that operated within the established categories of American law. Attorney-client privilege is a real and important protection. It serves genuine purposes in the legal system, protecting the candor of communications between clients and their counsel. The arrangement that Hardy helped construct for the tobacco industry used that protection for a different kind of purpose, not to ensure that companies could speak openly with their lawyers about genuine legal exposure, but to route the production of scientific knowledge through the legal category in advance, so that findings could be generated and then placed immediately into a protected status before they could reach any other channel. The arrangement was, in this sense, a use of a legitimate legal category in a way that the category had not been designed to accommodate, and it functioned because the distinction between a genuine attorney-client communication and a scientific report routed through an attorney to acquire privilege was not one that outsiders could easily see. The Legacy Tobacco Documents Library at the University of California, San Francisco holds approximately 14 million pages of internal tobacco industry documents. The collection was assembled through litigation and settlement processes over decades. The documents arrived in the library's care in various conditions, some well organized, some in disorder, some redacted in ways that later negotiations reduced. They were scanned, described, and made searchable. A researcher with a specific question can now enter search terms and retrieve memos, letters, strategy documents, grant records, laboratory notes, and legal correspondence from institutions that at the time the documents were produced had every expectation that their internal communications would remain internal. The library's existence is one of the more unusual outcomes of the tobacco litigation, a vast, permanent, publicly accessible archive of corporate private thought, available in perpetuity because a legal process eventually required the documents to be produced. What a researcher finds in the archive on a given day depends on what they are looking for. The collection is large enough that a person could spend years in it and not read everything. Some of what it contains is genuinely mundane: office management, routine correspondence between departments, administrative scheduling. Some of it is the internal scientific record, laboratory reports, and research summaries and grant correspondence that never entered the published literature. Some of it is the strategy documentation that describes, in language its authors clearly never expected to become public, what the tobacco industry understood its communication task to be. The 1969 Brown and Williamson memo sits in the archive alongside millions of other pages, retrievable by search, readable on a screen, its central phrase still sitting in the middle of its paragraph in the same plain typeface, in which it was originally typed. One of the things the archive makes visible is the professionalism with which the internal operations were conducted. The memos are competently written, the strategy discussions are sophisticated, the legal arrangements that structured the research programs were designed with care and maintained with consistency over long periods. The people who produced these documents were skilled at what they did. The Hill and Knowlton executives, who wrote strategy memos about managing the appearance of scientific controversy, were experienced practitioners of public communication who understood their craft. The lawyers who designed the attorney-client research routing were experienced practitioners of American law who understood privilege doctrine. The public affairs teams who described the Council for Tobacco Research to journalists as an independent scientific body understood how institutional credibility was built and what it looked like. The internal record documents not a casual or haphazard operation, but a sustained, organized, professionally managed effort to maintain a particular public position across multiple institutions and multiple decades. Victor DeNoble's laboratory, after it was dismantled, left no visible trace in the building that housed it. The research it had produced existed in DeNoble's memory, in whatever notes he had retained, and in the Philip Morris files that came into the public record only much later. In the years immediately following the dismantling, there was nothing in the published literature, no peer-reviewed paper, no conference presentation, no citation in another researcher's footnotes that indicated a Philip Morris scientist had produced, by 1983, data showing nicotine's reinforcing properties in animal models. The research had been conducted with real methods by a credentialed scientist at a major corporation, and it had reached real conclusions, and then it had moved out of the channels through which scientific knowledge ordinarily circulated into the broader world. The non-disclosure agreement that DeNoble signed was a private contract between an employee and an employer. It was not publicly filed. Its terms were not visible to the regulatory agencies that were in the same years making decisions about nicotine in cigarettes based on the published scientific literature. The FDA, reviewing the available published research in the mid-1980s, did not have access to DeNoble's findings because DeNoble's findings were not in the published research. They were in a filing cabinet somewhere in the files of Philip Morris, described in terms that kept them classified under attorney-client privilege. The gap between what was known inside the corporation and what was available to the agency that regulated the corporation was by design complete. There is something particular about the way knowledge operates when it exists in two different states simultaneously, present in a private record and absent from the public one. It does not disappear. It remains available to some people in some rooms. The researchers who produced it remember what they found. The lawyers who administered the privilege arrangements know what the folders in their filing cabinets contain. The executives who were briefed on the research understand the direction in which the findings pointed. None of this disappears. What disappears is the availability of the knowledge to the people outside those rooms, the physicians making clinical recommendations, the regulators making policy decisions, the ordinary individuals deciding how to manage their own habits and their own health. For those people, the knowledge is functionally absent because it cannot be found in the places they have access to. The published record, the library, the scientific literature, the regulatory file, in all of these, the knowledge is not there. The Council for Tobacco Research grant letter to a university scientist carries, in this light, a particular quality. It is not simply an ordinary communication between a funding body and a researcher. It is a letter that operates within a system designed to produce certain things and prevent others, and the scientist reading it on a morning in a university building is, without knowing it, touching the visible edge of something much larger and more deliberately constructed than the letter itself reveals. The research they will conduct may be genuine and well designed. The findings they produce may be real. Some of what the council funded produced legitimate scientific knowledge that entered the literature and contributed to the understanding of biological processes that had nothing directly to do with tobacco's most harmful effects. The design of the system did not require that all funded research be controlled or distorted. It required only that the most significant lines of inquiry be managed, that the findings most directly relevant to tobacco's commercial position be routed through channels that kept them out of the public record. The ordinary research could proceed normally. The ordinary research made the institution look like what it claimed to be. This is one of the features of the documentary record that takes some time to settle into view. The system did not depend on everything being false. It depended on certain specific things being managed, while enough genuine activity surrounded those managed things to make the whole structure look like what its public description said it was. The Council for Tobacco Research funded some science that was conducted honestly and published openly. The tobacco companies employed some scientists who worked on genuine problems unrelated to the central health question. Hill and Knowlton handled public relations work for clients in many industries and produced communications for those clients that did not involve the management of scientific controversy. The specific operations that the internal documents describe were embedded in larger institutional contexts that were, on their surface, unremarkable. The strategy was, in a sense, to be mostly normal, with the specifically consequential things happening quietly in the rooms that were not visible from outside. Brown and Williamson's 1969 memo, read carefully, describes a competitive situation. The author treats the published scientific evidence as something analogous to a competitor's product, something that exists in the market of public opinion and that the tobacco industry needed to counter with its own product, which was doubt. The framing is commercial. The body of fact is a thing to be competed with. The minds of the general public are a terrain on which that competition occurs. The outcome the author is working toward is not better scientific understanding or honest engagement with the evidence, but a state of sufficient public uncertainty to defer the consequences that the evidence would otherwise produce. It is a strategy memo about a communication problem, and it reads that way with complete clarity for anyone who finds it in the archive and follows its logic through to the end of the paragraph. The room where de Noble's laboratory once stood was empty when the equipment left. The fluorescent lights in a room like that stay on, whether the room is occupied or not. The building continues with its ordinary activities in the corridors outside. Somewhere in the company's files, the data from the years of work that had taken place in that room existed in the form of reports and memos that had been routed through legal counsel and classified accordingly. The knowledge was present in the institution in the form of those documents. The room itself showed nothing. The published literature showed nothing. For anyone outside the specific circle of people who had been in those rooms and read those files, the research that had taken place there was simply absent as completely as if it had never been conducted, which was the condition the arrangement had been designed to produce, and which it succeeded in producing for a number of years that stretched well beyond the morning when the cages were removed and the notebooks were collected and the door of an ordinary empty room was pulled shut. Merrill Williams stood at a copying machine in a Louisville law firm sometime in the early 1990s, feeding pages one at a time through the feeder tray, listening to the machine pull each sheet through its warm interior and release it face down in the output tray. The room around him was full of filing boxes. Brown and Williamson documents, sorted by date and subject, waited in stacks on long tables. His job was to review them, categorize them, make them manageable for the attorneys who would eventually use them. The machine hummed. Another page went through. Another copy settled into the tray. He had a doctorate in dramatic arts. He had come to the work through a temp agency, a paralegal with an unusual academic background, sorting paper in a room that by most appearances was simply a room where legal work got done. The stacks were high, the documents ran into the thousands, and somewhere in those stacks, early in his time with the project, Merrill Williams had begun to read more carefully than his job required. What he found in those pages was not, in its physical form, unusual. Typewritten memos, internal correspondence, research summaries, meeting notes, the kind of administrative paperwork that accumulates inside any large organization over decades. But the content of certain documents, read carefully, in sequence, by someone paying close attention, produced a picture that was distinct from anything the company had said publicly. He kept reading. He kept the machine running. He began at some point to take copies home at the end of the day in his briefcase, the warm photocopied pages tucked among his other papers, the machine's work product quietly multiplying itself outside the building where it had been produced. This went on for some time. The documents accumulated at home. He organized them. He held them. He knew, from the legal environment he was working in, something about what attorney-client privilege meant, and what discovery meant, and what it meant for a private citizen to possess documents of this kind. Eventually, through intermediaries, approximately 4,000 pages of those documents reached congressional investigators and attorneys working on anti-tobacco litigation. The path they traveled from the filing room in Louisville to the hands of people who could use them was not a straight line, and Williams himself spent years in a complicated legal position as a result of the choices he had made at that copying machine. What he produced, though, was a documentary record that had not previously existed in any publicly accessible form. Thousands of pages of internal Brown and Williamson material covering years of private corporate discussion about the science of their product, now outside the building where they had been stored. The copying machine's hum is not a dramatic sound. It is a sound associated with office work, with administration, with the ordinary bureaucratic maintenance of large organizations. That it was the instrument through which a significant portion of the internal tobacco record passed into public life is one of those details that is more interesting for being mundane. Williams had not arrived at the law firm with a plan. He had read carefully, and he had kept reading, and the machine had done what it was designed to do. Jeffrey Wigand arrived at his own position in this story from a different direction. His background was in biochemistry and endocrinology, and he had spent years in the pharmaceutical and consumer products industries before being recruited to Brown and Williamson as vice president for research and development. The job carried a significant salary and what appeared from the outside to be a significant mandate. Wigand had been told, in terms he later described as explicit, that he would be working to develop a safer cigarette. He came with credentials, with experience, with a genuine scientific background, and with what seems to have been a reasonable expectation that the company intended what it said. What he found inside Brown and Williamson in the years he spent there was a gap between that stated intention and the actual priorities of the organization as he experienced them. Research directions he considered important were discontinued. Questions he raised about specific chemical compounds in cigarettes met resistance he found difficult to justify on scientific grounds. And there were conversations, in meetings and in private exchanges, that added up over time to a picture of what the company's relationship to its own products' health effects actually was. By the early 1990s, Wigwin's employment at Brown and Williamson had ended, and he was living in Louisville, bound by a confidentiality agreement, and beginning to consider what he knew and what he could do with it. The decision he eventually made was not a simple one, and it did not happen quickly. Wigwin began speaking with investigators and attorneys who were building the cases that several state attorneys general were preparing against the tobacco industry. Mississippi's lawsuit against the tobacco companies required depositions from people with first-hand knowledge of how those companies had operated internally, and Wigwin gave one. His deposition was recorded. In it, he described under oath a private conversation with Thomas Sandifer, then chief executive of Brown and Williamson, in which Sandifer had described nicotine as the company's business. The plain commercial logic of that statement, that what the company was actually selling was a pharmacologically active substance, and that the company's leadership understood this, was not a claim that could be easily filed away once it had been made on record. Wigwin also spoke with CBS News. The producer Lowell Bergman had been working to bring insider testimony about the tobacco industry to 60 Minutes, and Wigwin agreed to be interviewed by Mike Wallace. He sat across from Wallace in a studio in 1995 and spoke in a measured, factual way about what he had known and seen. The camera recorded it. The interview, when it eventually aired, reached an audience measured in the millions on a Sunday evening. The specific things Wigwin said about nicotine, about specific chemical compounds in cigarettes, about the culture inside Brown and Williamson's research and development operation, were not claims that existed only in sealed legal depositions anymore. They were on television, in ordinary living rooms, in the broadcast stream of a major news program, available to anyone who had the channel on. Brown and Williamson's response to Wigwin's public profile was methodical. The company compiled a document of approximately 500 pages, gathering allegations against Wigwin's character, professional record, and personal history, and distributed it to news organizations. The document was a considerable undertaking. It represented real resources devoted to a single purpose, establishing in advance of any news investigation that might take Wigwin's testimony seriously that Wigwin was not a reliable source. Copies arrived at news organization offices across the country by courier, sitting on editors' desks in bound form, a dossier structured to raise doubt about a specific man's credibility before the reporters assigned to the story had made their own assessments. The Wall Street Journal assigned reporters to examine the document. They worked through it independently, checking its claims against the record, interviewing sources, doing the work that the dossier appeared to assume no one would bother to do. Their published investigation concluded that the allegations in the document were largely false or grossly distorted, and that the document itself appeared to constitute a coordinated attempt to undermine the credibility of a witness. That investigation appeared in the newspaper alongside Wigwin's name and Brown and Williamson's name, and readers could draw their own conclusions from the proximity of the two pieces of information, the dossier's existence and the findings of the reporters who had examined it. Wigwin continued. His deposition was unsealed. His television interview aired. His account of what he had known inside Brown and Williamson entered the public record and stayed there, and the 500-page document that had been assembled to precede and contradict him became, in the end, one more piece of evidence about how the company had chosen to conduct itself. Victor DeNoble's path to public testimony was more directly scientific and the circumstances that preceded it were more precisely documented than most, because the evidence of what had been done to his research had a physical form that could be described in specific terms. De Noble was a behavioral psychologist. Philip Morris had hired him to study nicotine's effects on behavior in animal models, and he had done that work carefully in a laboratory the company had equipped for the purpose, using the methods his field employed. The research produced results. The results were significant enough that De Noble and a colleague sought to publish them in a peer-reviewed scientific journal, and in 1983, the paper was accepted and published. It showed that nicotine functioned as a reinforcing addictive substance in the animal models he had studied, that the animals would work consistently and measurably to obtain it in the same behavioral patterns associated with other substances already understood to be addictive. After the paper appeared, Philip Morris's legal and public affairs teams examined what the published findings meant for the company's regulatory and litigation position. The conclusion those teams reached was reflected in what happened next. Philip Morris ordered the research terminated. They required De Noble to sign a non-disclosure agreement. They contacted the journal and pressured it to retract the paper. The journal retracted it. And then the physical apparatus of the laboratory, the animal cages, the behavioral testing equipment, the notebooks full of data, was dismantled by company order, taken apart, removed. The room where the research had been conducted was cleared. De Noble was left with what he could carry in his memory, the details of the work, the methodology, the findings, the sequence of events. He knew what the research had shown. He knew what had been done to it. He had signed a non-disclosure agreement, and for a period of years, the knowledge he held existed only inside him, with no published record to corroborate it, and no laboratory to point to. In 1994, Henry Waxman, the California congressman who chaired the House Subcommittee on Health and the Environment, convened a series of hearings on the tobacco industry. Waxman's committee was building a public record from multiple directions: documents, testimony, expert witnesses, and De Noble was called to testify. The non-disclosure agreement Philip Morris had required him to sign was, by the time of his testimony, a complicated legal instrument in a changed legal environment, and De Noble appeared before the committee. He described his former laboratory. He described the research. He described the findings, the retraction, the dismantling of the physical space where the work had been done. He described what the animals had shown and what the company had done with that showing. He was speaking from memory about a place that no longer existed in the form he was describing. The laboratory had been taken apart. The notebooks were gone. The published paper had been retracted from the journal. But what De Noble could offer the committee was precise spoken testimony about what had happened in that room and in the sequence of decisions that had followed its findings. His account was detailed, technical, and specific in the way that a scientist's account of their own work tends to be. He could describe the equipment, he could describe the animals, he could describe the behavioral protocols and what the results had looked like. The committee heard it, and it entered the congressional record in that form. Testimony about a physical space that had been deliberately unmade, reconstructed in careful spoken detail by the person who had worked there. De Noble's testimony represented something that the documentary evidence, on its own, could not fully accomplish. Documents could show what a company had written to itself. They could show the language of internal decisions, the wording of directives, the names on memos. What they could not show, with the same directness, was the experience of a scientist watching their own research be ordered, destroyed. De Noble could show that because he had been there, and because what he remembered was precise enough to stand under questioning. The committee room in 1994 received this testimony alongside testimony from many others, and the accumulation of it from former employees, from scientists, from people who had worked inside various parts of the industry, was building something that could not easily be set aside once it had been assembled in public. David Kessler was the commissioner of the Food and Drug Administration, and his approach to the tobacco question was methodical in a different way from either the congressional investigations or the state litigation. Beginning in the early 1990s and running through the middle of the decade, Kessler's office conducted a sustained investigation into how the tobacco industry had designed and manufactured its product. The investigation involved hundreds of interviews. Kessler and his investigators sat across from former tobacco company scientists, engineers, and employees in offices and conference rooms across the country. They asked detailed questions. They took notes. They accumulated testimony from people who had, in many cases, not previously told anyone outside their former employers what they knew. What the interviews produced was a picture of the cigarette as a designed and engineered product rather than a natural one. Former employees described how tobacco companies had studied nicotine delivery, the rate at which nicotine was absorbed, the variables that affected that rate, the ways in which manufacturing choices influenced how much nicotine a smoker received, and when. They described the engineering of cigarettes to optimize the experience of smoking in ways that were understood inside the companies to relate to the product's hold on its users. They described the structure of the research programs that had investigated these questions, how those programs were organized, who had access to their findings, and how decisions had been made about what would be published and what would not. Kessler's investigation was building toward a regulatory finding that the FDA had jurisdiction over tobacco products as drug delivery devices because the companies had demonstrated through their own internal records and manufacturing practices that they understood and manipulated the pharmacological properties of their product. That regulatory argument was legally complicated and would face years of litigation, but the investigative work that supported it, the interviews, the accumulated testimony, the examination of manufacturing records, and internal research programs produced a body of documented knowledge about how the industry had operated that was separate from any single legal outcome. Kessler wrote about what the investigation had found in a book published after he left the FDA, and the account he gave was precise and incremental in the way that a long, careful investigation tends to be. Not a single revealing moment, but hundreds of interviews, hundreds of pages of notes, a picture assembled detail by detail from people who had each known one part of it and who had, speaking to Kessler's investigators, placed their part alongside everyone else's. The investigators who drove away from each interview carried legal pads with handwritten notes on them. The notes would be reviewed, compared against other notes from other interviews, used to formulate the next set of questions for the next interview. The work was slow and repeating and unglamorous in the way that thorough investigation tends to be. Long drives, careful note-taking, the gradual accumulation of a record that was piece by piece becoming too large and too specific and too corroborated to dismiss. One thing worth noting about all of these individuals, Williams, Weigand, DeNoble, Kessler's unnamed interviewees, is the ordinariness of the professional roles they had originally occupied. Williams sorted documents. Weigand ran a research and development department. DeNoble studied animal behavior in a laboratory. The people who spoke to Kessler's investigators had worked in manufacturing, in chemistry, in regulatory affairs. They had gone to work each day in buildings with parking lots and cafeterias and the ordinary rhythms of corporate employment. What they knew, they had come to know through the ordinary accumulation of workplace experience, meetings attended, memos read, conversations overheard or participated in, work assigned and completed. The knowledge that eventually surfaced through their testimony or through the documents they carried out had not been obtained through any unusual access. It had accumulated, day by day, in the normal course of jobs they had held. This is part of what makes the eventual emergence of the record interesting to trace. The knowledge that the documents and testimony revealed had not been hidden in a vault or locked behind any single extraordinary barrier. It had been distributed in fragments from across thousands of ordinary working relationships inside multiple large companies, shielded primarily by the legal and contractual structures, the non-disclosure agreements, the attorney-client privilege designations, the research programs structured to ensure findings never reached the published record, that the companies had built specifically to manage the flow of internal knowledge outward. What dismantled those structures, slowly and in pieces, was the conjunction of people who had paid attention at their jobs, kept their own records, read carefully, and eventually found a path through litigation, through congressional committees, through regulatory investigation, to say what they knew in a setting where it could be heard and preserved. The Wall Street Journal's reporters working through Brown and Williamson's dossier on Weigand were doing the same kind of work from the outside, checking claims against documents, interviewing sources, following the record wherever it led, and then publishing what it showed. The tools were ordinary. The pace was slow. The product was a published account that sat alongside the dossier it had investigated, leaving readers to read both and draw their own conclusions. Merrill Williams, in the years after the documents he copied reached investigators and attorneys, went through a period of significant legal difficulty. Brown and Williamson pursued him. He lost access to his health insurance at a point when he was ill and needed it. He lived for a time in a small boat, his legal and personal situation uncertain, the consequences of the choices he had made at that copying machine playing out in ways that were not smooth or straightforward or particularly comfortable. His story does not resolve neatly. The documents he produced were used in litigation and in congressional investigation, and they entered the public record and had effects that were real and lasting. His own situation remained complicated for years. Wiggins' life after his testimony was also not uncomplicated. The threats, the legal pressures, the sustained campaign by Brown and Williamson to damage his credibility, these had real effects on his daily life and on his family. He eventually left Louisville, retrained as a teacher, and spent years working in secondary school science education, a career shift that placed him in a context entirely removed from the one in which he had become known. The distance between Brown and Williamson's research and development department and a high school science classroom is considerable, and Weigand crossed it. DeNoble continued working in public health and tobacco research after his congressional testimony, contributing to efforts to understand and communicate the addictive properties of tobacco products. The laboratory that Philip Morris had dismantled could not be rebuilt. The retracted paper remained retracted. But what he knew about what had happened in that room was now public, recorded in congressional testimony, and part of a body of evidence that was, by the mid-1990s, accumulating from enough different directions that its overall shape was becoming clear. Kessler's investigators kept their appointment books and drove to their interviews and filled their legal pads, and the notes they took went into the FDA's files and eventually into the published account Kessler gave of the investigation. The work continued after any single interview and after any single interview subject and the picture it produced was not the work of any one person, but of the slow accumulation of many careful conversations. There is a particular quality to the kind of knowledge that emerges through this process, through litigation discovery, through congressional investigation, through regulatory examination, that is different from the knowledge produced by, say, a single published scientific study or a single investigative news story. It is built from many fragments. Each fragment comes from someone who knew one part of the picture and described it, under oath or on record, in their own words and from their own position. The fragments do not always fit together perfectly. Witnesses remember differently. Documents sometimes contradict each other. The record is not a clean narrative, but an accumulation of partially overlapping accounts that, taken together, produce a picture more specific and more internally corroborated than any single account could. This is what a congressional hearing room is, at its most functional, a place where fragments are brought forward, placed in a common record, and made available to be read alongside each other. The person testifying describes what they knew from where they stood. The committee asks questions. The record grows. The next witness sits down and describes what they knew from where they stood. And the distance between what the accumulated record shows and what the companies had said publicly becomes, with each addition, more precisely measurable. The people who carried documents and testimony forward did not, in most cases, transform the overall picture by themselves. Merrill Williams's 4,000 pages added to the picture. Jeffrey Wigand's deposition and television interview added to it. Victor DeNoble's congressional testimony added to it. Kessler's hundreds of interviews added to it. None of these contributions individually was the complete story. Each was a piece of a record that was being assembled from many directions, and the assembly was slow and uneven and conducted under legal pressure from companies that had significant resources to spend on slowing it down. What the record eventually showed, in aggregate, after all the pieces had been placed together, was a gap between two things: what the companies had said about their product, and what their own internal documentation and the testimony of their former employees showed they had known. The gap had a duration. It could be measured in years. The internal record showed understanding that the public record did not reflect, and the people who had worked inside the companies had in many cases held knowledge that their non-disclosure agreements had been designed to keep precisely where it was. A legal pad on a car seat, covered in handwritten notes from another afternoon interview, carries no particular drama in itself. It is paper, it is ink, it is the ordinary artifact of a working day. But the notes on it describe something that the person who made them could not have obtained, except by sitting across from someone who had worked inside the industry and asking careful questions for several hours. Those notes, placed in a file with the notes from other interviews, placed in a room with the documents Williams had copied and the testimony DeNoble had given, placed in the same body of evidence as Wiggins' deposition and the Wall Street Journal's published investigation, added up to something. The car drives away. The notes sit on the passenger seat. The afternoon light falls across the highway in the particular way it does at that time of year in that part of the country, and the investigator is already thinking about the next interview, the next city, the next person who had been inside and was now willing to describe what they had seen. The work continues past any single moment of it. The record grows in the direction of completeness, one page, one legal pad, one careful conversation at a time. What had been known inside those companies, in private, for years before any of it was public, the pharmacological research, the engineering knowledge, the strategic discussions about how to manage the external perception of the science, had existed in a kind of suspended state, present in the world but not accessible to it, held in filing cabinets, and memories and sealed legal folders in law firm offices. The copying machines hum, the deposition camera running in a conference room, the congressional hearing room filling with people settling into their seats. These were the mechanisms by which the suspended state was, piece by piece, and over many years, resolved. The resolution was not clean. Some documents were gone. Some research had been destroyed in the physical sense, its equipment scattered, its notebooks absent from any archive. Some knowledge existed only in the memory of people who carried it forward in their own words, without a paper record to corroborate every detail. The picture that emerged from all of it was substantial and specific and internally consistent in its broad outlines, but it was also in its edges and corners, incomplete in the way that any record assembled under adversarial conditions tends to be. David Kessler's investigators drove away from that last interview with their notes and drove back toward whatever office the notes were going to, and the notes would be filed and read and compared against everything else. The afternoon was already settling toward evening by the time the highway opened up on the far side of the city. The next city was on the schedule for next week. The legal pad had more room on its remaining pages. The work was not finished, but the picture was, with each conversation added to it, continuing to fill in, slowly and in the particular quiet way that long, careful work tends to progress, not arriving at once, but accumulating, one measured observation at a time, towards something that could eventually be read whole. The hearing room on the morning of April 14th, 1994, was an ordinary federal space, long fluorescent lights, a raised dais for the committee members, rows of chairs filling steadily with press and observers as the morning moved toward the scheduled hour. The clerk at the front table was arranging papers. The camera operators were checking their equipment. 7 chairs had been placed in a row at the witness table, and the nameplates in front of those chairs read, in order, the names of the chief executives of the 7 largest tobacco companies in the United States. The room filled the way hearing rooms always fill, with the particular administrative quiet of an institution preparing to conduct its business, the ordinary sounds of chairs being adjusted, and water glasses set down, and microphones tested at low volume. There was nothing in the arrangement of the room that morning to suggest the event would be reproduced on the front page of newspapers across the country by the following day. The cameras were there, which meant someone expected significance. The committee members arrived in their own time and took their seats at the raised table with the practiced ease of people who had done this before. Henry Waxman, the chairman of the Subcommittee on Health and the Environment, was among them. The witness chairs were still empty. When the 7 executives took their seats, they were dressed in the ordinary professional clothing of American business, suits, ties, the conventional presentation of men who occupied the upper floors of large corporations. William Campbell, the president and chief executive officer of Philip Morris USA, was among them. James Johnston of R.J. Reynolds was there. Joseph Taddeo of United States Tobacco, Andrew Tisch of Lorillard, Edward Horrigan of Liggett Group, Donald Johnston of American Tobacco, and Thomas Sandifer of Brown and Williamson completed the row. The clerk asked them to rise. 7 men stood. 7 right hands were raised. The oath was read aloud in the flat, procedural cadence of a clerk who had read it many times before, a cadence designed not to emphasize, but simply to transmit, to make the words official, to move the proceeding into the category of sworn testimony rather than voluntary statement. Each man indicated in his turn that he understood the oath and would comply with its terms. They sat back down. The proceeding began. when Waxman's subcommittee asked each man directly and individually whether he believed nicotine to be addictive, each of the 7 said, under oath, that he did not believe that it was. The question was put clearly. The answers were given clearly. There was no ambiguity in the exchange, which was the reason it had been recorded, and the reason it would be replayed and described so many times in the years that followed. 7 men, one after another, giving the same answer to the same question, with the cameras running and the transcript accumulating word by word in the stenographer's record. The testimony that morning was not the only sworn statement ever given on the subject. It was one record among many that had been accumulating across years in courtrooms and deposition rooms and legislative chambers and regulatory offices across the country. But the image of the 7 raised hands had a particular quality that other records lacked, a visual simultaneity, all 7 men in the same frame at the same moment, the oath covering all of them at once. That was easy to describe and easy to reproduce and therefore easy to remember. Newspapers ran the photograph. Television news replayed the moment of the hands going up. The documentary record that surrounded the testimony, the internal memos, the suppressed research, the classified legal files, the notes from meetings where the industry's scientific strategy had been set, was not visible in the hearing room that morning. It was in filing cabinets and law firm archives, in a slowly growing collection at a university library in San Francisco, moving through legal proceedings and journalistic investigations at the pace of those processes rather than the pace of a single morning's television broadcast. What the hearing room produced was a public record of sworn statements. What was accumulating elsewhere was a much longer record of what the men who made those statements had known and when they had known it. In the years after the hearing, that longer record continued to move through the legal system along its own time. State attorneys general had been pursuing litigation against the tobacco companies since the early 1990s, and by the middle of the decade, that litigation had gathered into something larger than any single state could manage alone. The cases were numerous, and the discovery process had produced an enormous quantity of documents, and the strategic and financial position of the tobacco companies, facing simultaneous action across dozens of jurisdictions, had shifted in ways that made negotiation more plausible than it had been in the years when each case could be fought individually. The Master Settlement Agreement was signed on November 23, 1998. 4 companies, Philip Morris, R.J. Reynolds, Brown and Williamson, and Lorillard, were the primary signatories on the industry side. The attorneys general of 46 states, plus the District of Columbia and 5 United States territories, signed on behalf of the public health and financial interests they represented. The agreement required the companies to make payments totaling a minimum of $206 billion over 25 years, a figure that made it the largest civil litigation settlement in American history at the time it was signed. The $206 billion was one part of what the agreement required. A second part addressed marketing. The use of cartoon characters in cigarette advertising was banned, a provision that targeted directly R.J. Reynolds' Joe Camel campaign, which had been the subject of considerable public scrutiny over its apparent appeal to younger audiences. The agreement also restricted outdoor advertising and promotional merchandise, limiting the contexts in which cigarette brands could place their imagery. The restrictions were specific and documented, the kind that could be monitored and enforced, rather than the kind that could be quietly set aside. The agreement required the companies to fund a new organization, named at its founding the American Legacy Foundation, with an initial endowment of $5 billion. The foundation's stated purpose was to conduct anti-tobacco public health campaigns, the kind that its funding organizations had spent decades opposing and attempting to discredit. The industry had actively contested the creation of this organization during settlement negotiations, which meant that the requirement to fund it represented something the company's negotiators had preferred not to agree to and had agreed to anyway, because the alternative had been considered worse. The founding of the American Legacy Foundation with tobacco money was a feature of the settlement that sat in an unusual relationship with itself. The organization's budget came from the industry whose product it was created to make less appealing. Its campaigns were designed to reach the same population that tobacco advertising had been designed to reach. The money moved from one set of accounts to another, and then into the production of messaging that said in various forms and across various media that the product was harmful, and the industry had known it. The organization continued its work and eventually changed its name to Truth Initiative, the name under which it operates today, its endowment still producing the public health activity the settlement had required. The 1998 settlement was civil in nature, an agreement among parties in litigation, carrying financial and behavioral requirements, but not criminal penalties. A separate proceeding moved through the federal courts on a different track, reaching its conclusion nearly a decade later. The United States government brought suit against the tobacco companies under the Racketeer-Influenced and Corrupt Organizations Act, a federal statute typically associated with organized crime prosecutions, extended in this case to the conduct of a legal industry across several decades. The case was called United States v. Philip Morris, USA, and it moved through the federal court system at the pace of a major civil proceeding, with extensive discovery and extended proceedings that continued through the early 2000s. Judge Gladys Kessler issued her ruling in the case in 2006. The document was 1,683 pages long. In it, she found that the defendant tobacco companies had engaged in a decades-long conspiracy to defraud the American public about the health effects of smoking, the addictive properties of nicotine, and the industry's conduct with respect to both. The ruling's language was precise and measured in the way that judicial findings are, built from documented record, citing specific instances and specific documents, moving carefully from evidence to conclusion, and it was, across its 1,683 pages, categorical in its findings. The companies had known. The companies had organized their conduct around what they had known. The conduct had continued for a very long time. One phrase from the ruling was reproduced widely after the decision was released. Judge Kessler described the tobacco companies as having marketed and sold their lethal product with zeal, with deception, with a single-minded focus on their financial success. The sentence appeared in news accounts and in legal analyses and in the public discussion that followed the ruling. It was a sentence from a judicial document, language produced in the formal register of federal court, using the kinds of words, lethal, deception, zeal, that federal court language does not typically use without the weight of evidentiary record behind them. The ruling required something beyond its findings. As a remedy for the conduct the court had found, Judge Kessler ordered the companies to issue corrective statements, public communications appearing in major newspapers and on television, in which the companies would acknowledge, or in their own names, specific factual claims that smoking causes cancer and other serious diseases, that nicotine is addictive, that the companies had historically marketed cigarettes to young people, and that low tar and light cigarettes do not reduce the health risks of smoking. The companies were required to say these things publicly in paid placements under their own corporate names, with no hedging language of the kind that had characterized their public statements for decades. The corrective statements did not appear in 2006. The companies appealed the ruling, and the appeals process moved through the courts over the years that followed. The specific language of the corrective statements was litigated at length, whether they could include qualifying language, what format they would take, where they would appear, and how prominently. The process continued well past 2006, past 2010, past 2015. The statements eventually began appearing in 2017, more than a decade after the original order had been issued, the company's names attached to admissions that their legal teams had spent years attempting to delay, modify, or prevent. A person watching network television on a Sunday evening in 2017 might have seen one of the corrective statements appear in the ordinary flow of commercial programming, a tobacco company's name, and then the admission of a specific harm. The format was not designed for drama. It was designed for compliance, for placement, for the satisfaction of a court order rather than the satisfaction of a narrative. The admissions themselves were not new information by 2017. The science had been settled for decades. The internal documents had been public for years. The litigation record was extensive and available. What was new in 2017 was the source. A tobacco company saying under its own name, in paid broadcast time, the things that the documentary record had shown it had known and denied for the better part of the 20th century. The 63 years between the first major epidemiological studies of 1950 and the earliest corrective broadcasts in 2017 contained a great deal of material. They contained peer-reviewed research and public health campaigns and congressional hearings and litigation and settlement negotiations and federal court proceedings and appeals. They contained the internal documents that had been produced by the industry's own scientists and lawyers and public affairs teams, kept in files for years, and then made available through litigation and archival research. They contained the work of the researchers who had noticed the original signals in patient records and physician cohorts and prospective studies, and the work of the lawyers and investigators and former insiders who had moved information through the processes by which private knowledge becomes public record. The master settlement agreement's payments continued on the schedule the 1998 document had set. The funds went to the participating states, and the states used them in various ways, some to fund health programs, some to fill general revenue gaps, some to support specific anti-tobacco initiatives, and some for purposes unrelated to tobacco at all. The allocation of the settlement funds within individual states was a decision made by state legislatures and budget offices rather than by the settlement's terms, and it varied considerably across jurisdictions. The money moved through governmental budgets the way settlement funds tend to move, at some distance from the circumstances that had generated them. The Legacy Tobacco Documents Library at the University of California, San Francisco, had grown steadily since the documents began flowing into it through litigation discovery and whistleblower disclosures, and the settlement process itself. By the time the corrective statements were appearing on American television in 2017, the library's digital archive held tens of millions of pages, internal memos, research reports, legal communications, marketing materials, correspondence between executives and scientists, and lawyers and public affairs staff, all of it indexed and searchable, the accumulated private record of an industry's century of operations, now available to anyone with an internet connection and an interest in reading it. A researcher sitting with that archive in 2017, or in any year since, could trace the shape of what the documents together described. They could follow a single question: whether the companies had known that cigarette smoking causes cancer and had organized their public conduct around concealing or disputing that knowledge through the specific documents that touched on it. The internal research reports from the 1950s and 1960s, the public affairs strategy documents that described in plain language how to manage public perception of contested science, the legal structures that had been designed to route research findings through attorney-client privilege, the communications between executives about what the scientific evidence was showing and what the public response to it should be. The shape that emerged from reading through that material was not ambiguous, and it was not the work of interpretation. It was documented in the company's own words, their own numbers, their own handwriting, across their own decades. The Joe Camel campaign, banned by the settlement's marketing provisions, had run from 1988 to 1997. R.J. Reynolds had introduced the cartoon dromedary as the face of Camel cigarettes in the United States in 1988, and the character had spread across advertising in the full range of formats then available: billboards, magazines, point-of-sale displays, and merchandise including clothing and accessories. Research published in 1991 in the Journal of the American Medical Association found that a substantial proportion of children aged 3 to 6 recognized Joe Camel and could associate the character with cigarettes, a finding whose implications for the campaign's design were visible enough that the study received considerable public attention. The campaign continued for 6 more years after the study was published, ending only in 1997 when R.J. Reynolds announced it was discontinuing the character. The same year, the settlement negotiations were at an advanced stage. The question of whether the campaign had been designed to appeal to young audiences or had merely happened to appeal to them was one the company disputed at length. The internal documents from the period, now available in the Legacy Archive, included marketing research about the campaign's performance across different demographic groups and communications about the audience segments the campaign was intended to reach. The documents described what the company had known about who was looking at the campaign, and the campaign had continued, and the settlement had ended it, and the question of intent was folded into the much larger record the court proceedings had assembled. Truth Initiative, continuing the work of the organization founded with settlement funds in 1999, operated in the second decade of the 21st century as a public health organization focused on tobacco and nicotine use across all their forms: cigarettes, smokeless tobacco, electronic cigarettes, and the other nicotine delivery products that had entered the market in the years since the settlement. The organization produced research, operated public-facing campaigns, and maintained the programs the settlement had funded it to create. Its budget still drew on the original endowment, now supplemented by grants and other funding sources. Staff arrived each morning to work that was, in its core purpose, continuous with what the settlement had envisioned: public health activity designed to reduce tobacco use, financed in the first instance by the industry it was opposing. The 7 executives who had testified before Henry Waxman's subcommittee in April 1994 had mostly left the industry by the time the corrective statements began appearing in 2017. Thomas Sandifer of Brown and Williamson died in 1996, 2 years after the hearing. The companies themselves had continued, merged, been acquired, restructured. Philip Morris Companies became Altria Group. R.J. Reynolds merged with British American Tobacco. The names on buildings changed. The corporate structures evolved. The settlement payments continued on schedule. The legal obligations established in 1998 and 2006 persisted through the reorganizations. The corrective statements had a specific text, approved by the court after the years of appeals about their language, and that text was precise. It said that the companies had marketed cigarettes to youth. It said that nicotine is addictive. It said that cigarettes cause cancer. It said that the companies had intentionally designed cigarettes to make them more addictive. The language was categorical, present tense in its acknowledgement of past conduct, and signed, in a formal sense, by the companies themselves, the organizations whose history included the Frank Statement of 1954, the Tobacco Industry Research Committee, the Classified Special Projects Fund, the attorney-client privilege structures, the dossiers distributed to news organizations, and the 7 raised hands of April 1994. A person reading one of the corrective statement newspaper placements in 2017 was reading something that had no precedent in the form of what it was: a major American industry found by a federal court to have committed racketeering against the public it had served, required by that court to publish, in the format of a paid advertisement, an acknowledgement of the things it had spent decades denying. The Frank Statement of 1954 had also been a paid advertisement. It had appeared in 448 newspapers and reached an estimated 43 million readers on a winter morning, its formally worded text projecting concern and pledging support for independent science, its language designed to resemble a sincere public announcement rather than a corporate communication. The corrective statements appeared in the same format, paid placements in newspapers and on television, and their language said the opposite of everything the Frank Statement had said. Not because the facts had changed, but because the legal process had required the companies to say what the facts had always been. The 1,683 pages of Judge Kessler's ruling sat in the bound form that court documents take, available in the federal court record, its findings organized across the sections and subsections that a document of that scope requires. Legal scholars and public health researchers cited it. It entered the library of documents that characterized the tobacco litigation, a library that had grown to occupy, in its digital form, an enormous amount of storage space at the University of California, San Francisco, accessible without charge to anyone who wanted to read it. The archive was its own kind of record, not a narrative, not an argument, not a judgment, but a collection of primary material from which narratives and arguments and judgments could be drawn. It grew slowly as additional documents continued to enter it through ongoing litigation and research, and it remained available, and it continued to be used. The payments from the Master Settlement Agreement were still being made. The schedule ran to 2025 at minimum, and additional payments were structured to continue beyond that date. The attorneys general who had signed the agreement in 1998 had long since moved on to other offices, to private practice, to retirement. Their successors administered the settlement obligations through the ordinary governmental processes by which long-term agreements are maintained. The tobacco companies made their scheduled payments. The receiving states allocated the funds. The machinery of the settlement operated, as legal agreements do after the drama of their negotiation has passed, with the unremarkable regularity of an obligation being met. The researchers who had published their epidemiological findings in 1950, the case control studies, the prospective cohorts, the dose-response relationships that had seemed so difficult to attribute to coincidence, had not lived to see most of what the legal record eventually established. The British doctor's study had continued into the 1990s, its long arc of prospective data, producing findings of considerable strength on smoking and mortality across a range of diseases. The earlier researchers' methods and conclusions had held up against decades of subsequent work, had been refined and extended by researchers working in later years, and had been cited in the litigation record as establishing the epidemiological foundation for what the internal documents later confirmed from the other direction. The science and the documents formed two kinds of evidence pointing at the same question from opposite sides, and the question was not, by the time of Judge Kessler's ruling, genuinely open. The public health effects of the corrective statement requirement were difficult to measure precisely because they arrived in an information environment that had been shaped by decades of anti-tobacco messaging from multiple sources, and because the statements themselves, by the time they appeared in 2017, confirmed what public health communication had been saying for many years. A person who had followed tobacco news since the 1990s would not have learned a new fact from the corrective statements. What the statements provided was something different, the acknowledgement from the companies themselves in a format the companies had to pay for of the things the public record had established. The evidentiary value of that acknowledgement had been important to the court's remedy, even if its informational value to an already informed public was limited. Truth Initiative's offices were open on ordinary working days, staff doing the work the organization had been created to do, researching nicotine use trends, developing public health campaigns, monitoring the tobacco and nicotine landscape as electronic cigarettes and other new products changed the shape of what the organization was tracking. The founding endowment had been invested and had produced returns over the years since 1999, and the organization's budget reflected both the original funds and the returns they had generated, and the additional funding it had gathered in the years of its operation. The work it did each day was continuous with the settlement's purpose, even as the specific landscape of nicotine use had changed considerably from the landscape of 1998. The 7 chairs at the witness table in the Rayburn House office building on April 14, 1994, had been ordinary hearing room chairs. They had been arranged that morning for a specific occasion, filled by specific people, and then returned to whatever storage or circulation such chairs are part of. The moment they had framed, the 7 raised hands, the clerk reading the oath, the questions and answers recorded in the transcript, persisted in the documentary record in the way that all sworn testimony persists, available for citation and reference as long as the record is maintained. The image the cameras had produced that morning was part of a public archive, and the transcript was part of a legal archive, and both continued to exist alongside the internal documents and the court rulings and the settlement paperwork and the corrective statements, all of it accumulating without urgency into the very large record of a very long story, the long river of what the tobacco story produced. In documents, in legal obligations, in organizational structures, in public health infrastructure, continued moving at its own pace, well past the moments that had felt most significant when they occurred. The frank statement of 1954 had felt like a resolution to some of the people who read it, and the hearing of 1994 had felt like a reckoning to some of the people who watched it, and the settlement of 1998 had felt like a conclusion to some of the lawyers who signed it, and the ruling of 2006 had felt like a verdict to some of the journalists who wrote about it. Each of those moments was also a point in a sequence that kept moving. The corrective statements that began in 2017 were a point in the same sequence. The offices of Truth Initiative, open on any given working morning, are another. What the record shows across all of it is a kind of long patience